Hello and welcome to Housing and Hazards, How We Should Protect Vulnerable Homes. We're going to get started in just a minute or two as people file into the room. Okay, it looks like we still have a good number of people entering, but we also have a number of people already here. So I think we should get started in the interest of time. So welcome again to Housing and Hazards, How Should We Protect Vulnerable Homes? I am super excited to be able to participate in this session. I'm very excited to be a part of this panel for a variety of reasons, but foremost, I think housing type and home, more generally, don't get the attention that they deserve when it comes to thinking about shaping vulnerability to climate change and adaptation to climate change. But also because over the last few years, I've been interested in manufactured housing as a nexus of various forms of vulnerability. And a lot of people here have contributed to deepening certainly my understanding of the connections between housing and vulnerability, especially around that particular housing type. So I'm super excited. I'm glad you're all here. But before I introduce today's panelists, I just want to thank some of the sponsors for today. Here they are, a headline sponsor, Edison International, and just a few ground rules also about how this is going to work today. So we want to advance to the next slide. You'll see that in this Bizaboo format, you can move things around on the screen so that you can sort of optimize your viewing. If you have questions for any of the presenters during their presentations, you can use the Q&A function, which at least for me is on the right side of my screen. And so you can enter those questions in. The presentations are going to be 15 minutes in length with a little bit of time for Q&A at the end. I will try to start the Q&A with perhaps one question from the chat. And then maybe a follow-up question live from the audience if possible. If after we get through all of the presentations, there's a little bit of time left, we'll have an opportunity for general discussion and Q&A at the end. So our first presenter will be CJ Gabbe, who's with us from Santa Clara University's Department of Environmental Studies and Sciences. And his research focuses on land use, housing, and climate change vulnerability. Then we'll have Smitha from the College of Social Work at the Ohio State University, whose work focuses on social vulnerability in the context of disasters and extreme weather events. Then Esther Sullivan from the University of Colorado at Denver, whose work focuses on poverty and spatial inequality, especially in relation to housing and the built environment. And then finally, we'll have Zachary, who's with us from UC Berkeley, and his work is interested in the role of urban planning, design, and property regimes in shaping uneven vulnerability to climate change. So let's get started. First off is CJ. Take it away, CJ.
Hi, everybody. Hopefully you can hear and see me all right now. Thanks, Mark, for moderating. I wanted to advance to first slide. I wanted to start by thanking the UCLA Luskin Center for putting on this wonderful event. And I wish we could all be together in person, but I've really enjoyed seeing research yesterday, and I'm looking forward to some more presentations today. The work that I'm going to present today is a collaboration with Evan Mullen from Georgia Tech and my former student and SCU alum, Alex Varney. And our project is really focused on housing and heat-related disparities in San Jose, California. And we want this to be something that's relevant for both scholars, and policy and planning audiences. So for scholars, this research is really intended to expand our understanding of climate vulnerability, particularly as it relates to housing types. And for policymakers, I'm hoping this will help inform local and state and federal housing responses that support health and reduce the risk of heat-related illness and death. So broadly, we're answering questions about how different factors that affect heat vulnerability, in the case of this research, tree canopy, outdoor temperature, and air conditioning provision may vary by housing type. And we're focusing on San Jose, California, not only a city that I'm located near, but it's a city of 1 million people or so. It's the 10th largest city in the US. It's in the southern part of the San Francisco Bay Area, and it's a city that is the largest city of Silicon Valley. So it's a city that has, I think, lessons from many parts of the US. And our research questions emerged from a lot of existing knowledge about how communities of color and low-income communities are disproportionately exposed to heat in cities in the US. And we know that the built environment matters, and we know that housing matters. And there are certain housing characteristics, including air conditioning access, that have been shown to improve health outcomes. And some of my previous research with Greg Pierce in particular has been looking at how subsidized housing and manufactured housing in California, and I'm suspect in many other places, tend to be located at the intersection of heat and future extreme heat and social vulnerability. And I'm interested in housing because it has this opportunity for us to not only intervene in the place that people spend the most time, but it's also something that has been understudied, as Mark mentioned in the introduction today too. So the analysis that we're doing here is one in which we start with a parcel level data set that we created of housing characteristics for all of the city of San Jose. And then we combined it with a set of census tract or neighborhood level characteristics, and then our 3 measures of heat risk. And so we essentially created 4 housing categories based on assessor data and based on the city's affordable housing data. And so our 4 categories, I'll be talking about these a bunch of times, so I'll try to explain them fairly succinctly now. But detached single family housing, this is probably going to be primarily owner occupied, but not exclusively so. Attached owner occupied housing, so this is going to be townhomes or condos. And then this is going to be contrasted with attached rental housing that are going to be market rate apartments. And then the 4th category is affordable housing, which is primarily attached to. So we've got single family housing, townhomes and condos, market rate rental, and then affordable housing. Unfortunately, and this is a little bit heartbreaking to me, is the assessor data for manufactured housing leaves something to be desired. And so I think we're going to be figuring out how to incorporate that in a future phase, particularly getting into the units in mobile home parks. So stay tuned. The next time we present this, we should hopefully have more data on those categories. And then we're focused on 3 measures of heat risk, and 2 relate to outdoor exposure and 1 relates to indoor temperatures or adaptive capacity indoors. And so we've scaled all of these measures in a way so that lower values mean lower risk and higher values mean higher risk. So we can say lack of tree canopy, places that have a greater lack of tree canopy are going to have a greater a risk of heat exposure. Places with higher temperatures will have a greater risk of exposure. Places that have a higher probability of no central AC will have greater risk of heat exposure. And I should mention too that our model of central air conditioning provision is based on American Housing Survey that we have modeled at the parcel level based on characteristics including housing type, age, and subsidy. And we're doing this following Gronlund and Barakal's excellent 2020 paper. So this is kind of a neat new area for us to think about heat risk in this way. And then we also create a pretty simple heat risk index that includes our 3 components. So we divide it into exposure, which is made up of the tree canopy and temperature variables, land surface temperature variables. And then we have the adaptive capacity variable, which is made up of the probability of no central AC. And so simple measure, but we want to try to start getting at where are some of the housing locations that may have, that may be more exposed in several different ways. And then we explore relationships between heat risk factors and neighborhood characteristics and other population characteristics by specifying a set of linear regression models. And essentially, our dependent variables in these models are our heat risk variables. And then our independent variables include our categorical variable of housing type, local population density, the share of residents under the age of 5, over the age of 65, the share of residents who are Black, Hispanic, Asian, the median income, housing tenure, and then the share of residents with a college degree. So we're starting to do some exploratory modeling here to understand some of these relationships between our heat risk factors and other factors. So before I really get into our results by housing type, I want to take a minute to think about some of the spatial distribution of these residential heat risk factors. And as you can see on these maps, and as you know from your experiences and other evidence, tree canopy and surface temperatures and air conditioning access are not evenly or randomly distributed spatially across the city of San Jose. We see a few different patterns that are emerging here. In the central and eastern parts of San Jose, there tends to be much fewer trees and more sun exposure in those areas. We know that some of those same areas, as well as parts of central and southern San Jose, tend to have higher surface temperatures using our land surface temperature measure, which is, admittedly an imprecise measure of human experience, but one that we want to bring in with tree canopy to understand some of these outdoor temperature factors. And then we also know that central air conditioning tends to be least likely in some of the city's older, more centrally located neighborhoods, as well as some of the eastern parts of San Jose. And just zooming out again, we can think about these factors relative to where the housing types are located in San Jose. So the map on the left shows by parcel the housing type, and this map is a sea of yellow, and that yellow is single family housing. And so not surprisingly, the dominant land use in San Jose is single family housing. And so we can see that this single family housing intersects with heat risk, but so do some of the other housing types, particularly some of the denser housing types in downtown San Jose and some of the surrounding neighborhoods. In terms of overall heat risk, the neighborhoods that include the most consistently high heat risk across our 3 factors include East San Jose, downtown, and the fairgrounds and surrounding areas. And these areas tend to be denser than others in the city, have more Hispanic or Latino residents, and have households with lower incomes to generalize those areas. So now, in order to illustrate a little bit more about how the measures of heat risk varies by housing type, I want to highlight a few things from these box plots. And I think it's interesting because in some ways, there's more variation spatially in these measures than there is by housing type, at least for the first 2 measures. So affordable housing was located in areas with the least tree canopy, and attached ownership housing, that's condos and townhomes, were located in areas with the most tree canopy. And in general, though, most housing types do not have much tree canopy around them. The range was around 81% to 84% without tree canopy. So this is an area that I know the city of San Jose is focused on expanding this limited tree cover. In terms of temperature, the hottest housing type was the market rate apartments, and the coolest housing type was the townhomes and condos. And here the range was about 110 degrees to 112 degrees with affordable housing and single-family housing in the middle. But there was really the most variation in our model of the probability of no central air conditioning. Most single-family housing units in San Jose have central air conditioning. It's closer to 50-50 in terms of affordable housing and condos and townhomes. But when we see the market rate multifamily, this is where we see the most units. About nearly 3/4 don't have central air conditioning. And this seems to be really a function of lots of kind of small, older, attached multifamily dwelling units. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. And then zooming out a little bit more, when we combine these outdoor and indoor measures, the outdoor exposure and adaptive capacity, we see that this market rate apartment type seems to be at the highest risk. Using this admittedly simple measure, and we see that's followed by affordable housing, townhomes and condominiums, and then by single family housing. So in general, this kind of gradient of heat risk matched pretty well with what we might have expected in terms of the relative or comparative degrees of risk. And I'll talk a little bit more about particularly the multifamily market rate versus affordable distinction here in a second. And then in our regression results, some of these descriptive relationships that I just showed were also apparent through our regressions. In particular, we saw that attached rental housing, the market rate, was consistently associated with elevated heat risk relative to the single family housing type, which was our reference group. And the most surprising finding here, I think, was that affordable housing, there was no significant difference between affordable housing and single family housing in terms of any of our heat risk factors. In terms of race and ethnicity, the neighborhood shares of Hispanic or Latino residents and Asian residents were associated with elevated heat risk in terms of tree canopy and temperatures, but the share of Black residents was not significantly associated with any of the three factors. In general, denser neighborhoods were associated with hotter temperatures and less central air conditioning, but none of our age and income variables were significantly associated with our heat risk factors, and that's something we're going to explore more as we follow this up. So a few key findings that I want to talk a bit about. So what does this all mean? And there is variation by both neighborhood and by housing type. And I think the biggest difference that we observed was in terms of central air conditioning availability, a little bit less so in terms of temperature and tree canopy. And we know, and this is supported some of our hypotheses going into this, was that rental multifamily would face more heat risks, particularly than single family housing. And affordable housing's relatively better performance seemed to be a function of this combination of newer structures, larger developments, and then also closer in locations that tended to have more existing tree canopy than some of the newer suburban style developments that were closer to the edges of San Jose. And I think this has implications for housing policymakers as well as planners more broadly. And that really has to do with this combination of site level and neighborhood scale investments and the need to focus on interventions that will be reducing the heat risk for low-income renters who seem to have the most heat risk in San Jose, and I would expect many other cities, particularly in the West. So these might be investments in shade and energy efficiency upgrades, cool roofs, air conditioning subsidies, and utility assistance as needed. But also thinking about how we can expand neighborhood scale investments, including urban forestry and tree canopy investments, expanded parks, particularly in neighborhoods that have been most disinvested in San Jose, and many other cities, including low-income neighborhoods and communities of color. And that I think, while it's somewhat heartening to see that affordable housing was relatively similar in our heat risk measures as single-family housing, the reality is residents of affordable housing are probably going to be more socially vulnerable. And we know these locations of affordable housing will be long-term locations of low-income households. So there really is the necessity for a priority for explicit policies that focus on heat for affordable housing residents. And like any good research project, and this is hot off the press, so I really welcome your questions, your feedback, your thoughts as we draft this paper. I think this research brought up as many questions as it answered, and particularly thinking about how we might see different results if we use different outdoor temperature measures like mean radiant temperature or simply air temperature. I mean, we don't know what the indoor temperatures were like in these units, particularly in dwelling units with window air conditioning or portable air conditioning units. There's probably an interaction between the housing characteristics and some of the neighborhood characteristics in terms of exposure, whether it's waiting at the bus stop or the amount of tree canopy at local schools or workplaces. We would expect that these areas of heat risk also intersect with air pollution and other environmental hazards, and we would love to quantify that. And then I want to better understand how developers consider heat in the design and development process, including how decisions are made about expanding air conditioning access and also increasing energy efficiency. So some food for thought there. Thanks so much for all of you starting your morning with our session, and I welcome any questions or comments. Also encourage you to reach out if you want to just connect offline or after this. Feel free to shoot me an email or connect through social media or some other way. So thanks so much. So I think, Mark, do you have a question first, or do you want me to just jump into it? Okay, so the first question is about super shade structures. So this is really getting at some of the issues of kind of human created shade versus tree canopy. And I think this is a really important point. I'm just kind of skimming your question here. I think this is an important point because we know that in areas with limited tree canopy, it does take time for the trees to grow and for us to see changes here. And in the interim, particularly, we are able to create some of the benefits of shading using, I think, what you're describing as this questionnaire in terms of human created shade. So yeah, I think this is something we need to think about. We don't really have much data on human created shade. And I think that's something I'd like to add to our list of better understanding the dynamics on the site level for sure. Are there other questions here? Well, if not, I will turn it back over to Mark, and I think Smitha will be up. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, Mark, I did not hear you, so I'm guessing you gave me the go-ahead. So I hope everyone can hear me okay. Let's see. Thank you, everyone, for having me here. I'm Smitha, and I use the she and they pronouns. And before I begin, I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking from the ancestral and contemporary lands of the Shawnee, the Potawatomi, Delaware, Miami, Peoria, Seneca, Wyandot, Ojibwe, and Cherokee peoples, and I acknowledge and honor the people who have stewarded this land and my role in working toward social, economic, and environmental justice. So I know this is not the crowd that I need to convince when I say that the climate crisis is the most cross-cutting issue of our time, the foremost social justice issue, and because it's a convergence of ecological destruction, of social inequality and oppression at multiple levels, and economic failures. And even before the latest IPCC report, we knew that disasters are here to stay. And even under the best case scenarios, some forms of disasters, climate disasters, are going to be more frequent and more intense. And evidence suggests that the burden of these disasters in terms of mortality as well as long-standing ramifications really falls disproportionately on vulnerable groups. The multiple studies that have examined the impacts of disasters on socially vulnerable populations all emphasize the need for preparedness as an adaptive step at individual, community, household, and national levels as a preventative factor. But world over, preparedness remains pretty low. Because this is a mixed audience, I want to talk about what preparedness means. In the wake of large-scale tragedies like Hurricane Katrina, the US federal agencies started implementing public education campaigns on community preparedness that would help groups and individuals and households sustain in the period before outside help arrives in the event of disasters. Disaster preparedness then refers to the knowledge and capacities developed by governments, communities, households, and individuals to effectively anticipate, respond to, and recover from the impacts of these hazardous events. At the household level, pre-event preparatory actions would include, say, having and discussing an evacuation plan with your family, having an emergency kit with food, water, first aid kits, batteries prepared and ready to go, having a communication plan, discussing with your family about keeping your documents and some cash ready to go, etc. In the US as well, studies and surveys have showed substantial gaps in preparedness levels among individuals and households, therefore making it imperative to understand the individual, the societal factors associated with preparedness, identify gaps, and leverage points. Now, a parallel and often co-occurring phenomenon in the US is the affordable housing crisis, which is in itself associated with a range of adverse outcomes, including intergenerational poverty, rising homelessness, among other effects as a result of another convergence of demographics, years of discriminatory, often racist policies, housing and zoning policies, and lopsided market mechanisms that continue till today. Housing insecurity really is a broad umbrella term encompassing safety, affordability, quality, the inability to pay for utilities, etc. And housing insecurity is both a driver of and a result of longstanding disparities in the US, and it often is racialized. It falls along racial and income lines, impacting not just how communities are affected in a disaster, but also sometimes influencing how households are able to respond to future stressors. Now, there have been multiple studies that have found that inadequacies in housing factors, such as housing quality, affordability, and neighborhood risk, even can disadvantage, and heighten risks during and after disasters. So it's possible then that the ability to plan for a disaster is also associated with these housing and neighborhood and social inequities. Which brings us to the research question at hand, examining household and neighborhood correlates in addition to contextual vulnerability in their association with preparedness. The driving theoretical framework is the human capabilities approach, where the ultimate outcome really is that all persons have the capability to lead the life that they value and reach their full potential. In the literature on climate change and disasters, social and contextual vulnerability is often measured as a series of indicators affecting a person or group's capacity to plan for, deal with, withstand, and restore functionings after a disaster. Social vulnerability is denoted by socioeconomic and demographic factors that affect a community's adaptive capacity and resilience. And structural vulnerability, we theorize it as the site of intersecting power hierarchies or historical policies that are manifest in systems such as housing and immigration or healthcare in the US that affect an individual or group's probability of encountering barriers that can constrain decision-making or access to resources, therefore putting them at risk for negative health and other outcomes. Preparedness, therefore, is understood as a capability set. It's a set of behaviors to avoid poverty, to avoid injury, to avoid death due to disasters, which are all a factor of individual, contextual, and policy features that can potentially determine the resources that these individuals and households have access to. This conceptual framework for the paper shows that social and structural vulnerabilities are hypothesized to directly be associated with preparedness, and housing insecurity also moderates the relationship between social vulnerability and preparedness. Housing insecurity, therefore, is assumed to have both direct and multiplicative effects with social vulnerability on the dependent variable. We used the American Housing Surveys, a nationally representative data set. It's from the US Census Bureau and the Department of Housing and Urban Development. AHS have been conducted since the 70s, and they have questions on neighborhood and household characteristics. You'll see a lot of that in housing research. The data universe really consists of all residential housing units in the country. At the time of survey, we used the 2017 data, and each housing unit in the national sample represents anywhere from a few hundred to a few thousand housing units in the country. The dependent variable is conceptualized in two ways to capture the differences according to different operationalizations. Shout out to Natasha Malmin's work. Similar to previous scholarship, the unweighted total score across 9 preparatory items gives us the cumulative preparedness, and we also operationalize preparedness as a dummy variable called minimal preparedness, which is measured using variables on having food, water, finances, and access to a vehicle. Those without any of these items were coded 0, not minimally prepared, and those who were prepared for all these elements were coded 1. For the independent variables, for structural vulnerability, we had housing insecurity, which we measured as delinquencies or inabilities to pay rent, mortgage, and utilities. And housing adequacy was measured. It's really assessed by the Housing and Urban Development on a range of measures on quality of housing, including plumbing, heating, electricity, other maintenance and upkeep issues. The 3 categories of severely, moderately, and severely inadequate, moderately inadequate, and adequate were collapsed into a dichotomous variable, adequate or inadequate. Neighborhood risk examined the respondent perception on whether they lived in a neighborhood more at risk for floods and disasters. And social vulnerability was measured across socioeconomic status, minority status, and household composition variables. We constructed linear and logistic models based on how preparedness was conceptualized. The mean preparedness score in the sample was just over 5 across the 9 items. In terms of minimal preparedness, 57% of the population was not prepared. That is, they reported not being prepared with food, water, funds, and transportation in event of a disaster. 18% of the sample could be classified as living in housing insecurity, as we defined it. Housing adequacy and neighborhood risk perception had a low variability. As you can see, only about 5% of the sample could be classified as living in inadequate housing, and about 8% of the sample perceived their neighborhood to be at high risk for floods or other disasters. About 36% of the sample earned below $3,000 per month. Similar to the US demographics, the demographic distribution, 78% of respondents were white, 14% Black or African American, 5% identified as Asian, and 3% identified as American Indian, Pacific Islander, Alaska Native, or belonging to 2 or more races. The primary adult in the household was male in 52% of the homes, and about half the respondents were married at the time of the survey. 1 in 2 households in the US had either an older adult or a person with disability at home. And both these groups have specific vulnerabilities that are often associated with adverse outcomes after a disaster. So these were important groups to keep in mind. The first research question asked how social and structural vulnerabilities were related with preparedness. In terms of structural vulnerability, adjusting for other variables in the model, having adequate quality housing was associated with slightly higher score in preparedness compared to those who lived in houses that were classified as inadequate quality by the HUD, compared to those who were able to afford their rent, mortgage, and utilities. Living in housing insecurity decreased the cumulative preparedness by about 0.18 points, the negative coefficient over here, controlling for other social vulnerability indicators. In terms of social vulnerability, not surprisingly, higher socioeconomic status was positively associated with preparedness. Compared to male householders, on average, women householders scored lower on the preparedness score. The presence of an older adult at home was associated with higher preparedness, and the presence of a person with disability at home was associated with slightly lower preparedness score. On the second operationalization of the dependent variable, living in adequate quality housing was associated with 89% higher odds of being prepared with food, water, funds, and access to transportation in event of a disaster, compared to those whose housing did not meet that criteria. Being housing insecure significantly lowered the chances of being minimally prepared by about 21%. The race of the householder was statistically significantly associated with being minimally prepared. Those who reported being Black only had 15% lower odds of being minimally prepared. These are the Black householders. Women householders had lower odds of being prepared compared to male counterparts, again, in this conceptualization. And similar to the last conceptualization, presence of persons with disability was associated with lower chances of being prepared, and presence of older adults at home increased the odds of being minimally prepared. The second question, for the second question, we built 22 regression models, 11 OLS and 11 logistic models interacting housing insecurity with each of the social vulnerability indicators in our study. The x-axis shows the dichotomous variable of housing insecurity, and the y-axis show the predicted probability or the estimated score of preparedness. In terms of minimal preparedness, the correlation of the sex of the householder with minimal preparedness was moderated by housing insecurity. The blue line in front of you represents the male householders, and the red represents the female householders. The graph suggests that male householders were more likely to be minimally prepared when compared to female householders when they were not housing insecure, but that this gap increased when housing insecurity came into the picture. Another interesting finding was that housing insecurity moderated the relationship between the presence of an older adult at home and minimal preparedness. Households with older adults at home were able to maintain their preparedness levels even when they were housing insecure, as opposed to those who did not have any older adults at home. Let's talk about some limitations of the study. So the data were cross-sectional, and we do not assume either causality or directionality. And still, the results were exciting enough for us to, they warrant further exploration using longitudinal data, which the AHS kind of gives us the opportunity to do in the future. Secondly, there's no established scale of disaster preparedness. The measures were theoretically driven and have been used in studies before and are consistent with FEMA guidelines. The study also provides a broad overview of preparedness and social and structural vulnerability, but we must remember that all disasters are not the same, they're not equal, and there might be some measures that become more important based on the disaster we are talking about. This is a national estimate. So for example, an evacuation plan might be more important in a wildfire or a hurricane situation, as we had a couple of weeks back, or food, water, medicines, the stock keeping might be more important in the case of a shelter at home situation. And finally, the administrative data that we used is amazing. It obviates the time and expenses of data collection and is representative of the larger population, but it comes with its own set of limitations. For example, we use the publicly available data set files, and therefore we were not able to get a more granular look at the smaller geographies, although we did perform some sensitivity analysis to understand regional differences, if any. Let's examine some key takeaways. Housing security and quality were vital conditions for households being better prepared. Now, this is a key finding. We know that housing in the built environment, including neighborhood disadvantage, are associated with multiple social and health disparities. Disadvantage, not advantage. Therefore, an integrated housing policy that takes climate risk and disaster risk into account becomes paramount. Green New Deal for housing. Shout out. Women householders were less prepared than men, similar to many other studies that have examined predictors of how emergency preparedness, even in smaller samples. This is particularly alarming for us because women and feminine presenting people are traditionally underserved and discriminated in society. And they're also the most disproportionately affected after disasters. So this is a key area that merits continuing attention. Despite this growing interest and focus on gender disaggregated analysis, gender disaggregated data tend to be difficult to come by, and even when they are present, they seldom go beyond the gender binary, therefore rendering many gender and sexual minorities invisible. And the presence of a person with disability in the house was related with lower preparedness. This is a finding that was consistent with previous scholarship that discovered that perhaps some of this disparity could be due to the burden of additional roles and responsibilities assumed by caregivers. There is clearly a need to identify and work to improve access to resources and information for persons with disability and houses with persons with disability before a disaster strikes to ensure the best chances for this group. The presence of an older adult, that being associated with higher preparedness, perhaps that suggests some form of generational knowledge. While we acknowledge that older adults have specific vulnerabilities when it comes to natural disasters, they could also be potential resources as change agents in enhancing preparedness. Now, prior experience of a disaster is often considered a key determinant. So perhaps having an older adult at home is acting as a proxy for prior experience for households. That's something that future studies should be looking at. There's a lot of evidence to show that disproportionate impacts of disasters on renters. Low-income households are more likely to be female-headed, to be racial minorities, more likely to be renting than owning homes. So investment in good, safe quality, affordable public housing can go a long way in ensuring that these communities don't keep falling through the cracks. And in terms of implications, there are many minority races, including Asian and American Indian and Native Alaskan groups. They were all collapsed in our study into a singular group for the regression analysis. While this was done for statistical convenience, this can be problematic, and we want to acknowledge that because that can erase the diversity within these groups. It's important to understand that these groups remain understudied, and this should be, will be centered in future studies. And this also touches upon several aspects of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, helping extend conversations, continue conversations on disaster risk reduction and improved community preparedness as an adaptive strategy. And finally, I want to leave you with the idea that I'm sure many of us in this conference are talking about, that anything that we are talking about, including disaster preparedness, is one small part of the big picture. It is not a panacea, but it's still a good measure of capacity before a disaster happens to understand and maybe inform the gaps in recovery afterward. And that's it for me. Those are the measures for disaster preparedness. And I'll take questions or go on.
We have right on time for about 20 minutes for Smitha. Thank you very much, Smitha. But I think that we maybe have time for one quick question, if there are any questions from the audience before we hand things over to Esther Sullivan. I'm not seeing anything in the chat, but I think that, you know, this your talk brought up a number of questions that I were emerging after CJ's as well. So perhaps a more cross-cutting conversation will work well at the end. So I'm going to invite Esther onto the stage to present her paper. I don't know if anyone can hear me, but I'm pretty sure that we can't hear you, Esther. At least I can't hear you. So I don't know if you want to look to the moderator chat. And I know that Zach can't hear you either. I'm not sure if there's someone doing tech support on here that can help us. Esther, do you want to refresh the screen? It looks like Peter's suggesting. Sorry, I would have intervened earlier there, but I thought that, Peter, I thought you were aware of what was going on.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I'm so sorry, everyone. You know, we did a dry run through ahead of time, and we all got here early to avoid just these things and tested this equipment. So just one of the joys of being remote. So yes, I will keep my eye on the moderator chat, and just let me know if anything is going wrong. Anyway, so sorry. Let me just quickly then make up some time and say that I'm representing a team of researchers at the University of Colorado and Texas A&M University. And our broader goal in this research project is to understand the potential impact of climate change on mobile home parks as a really particular housing type. Why is it so important to understand the impact of climate change on manufactured housing? Because simply put, manufactured housing is a primary source of affordable housing in this country, and it is a primary route to low-income home ownership in the US. 70% of homes sold under $125,000 are manufactured homes. And, you know, a note on terminology here is that manufactured housing is also referred to as mobile homes, sometimes as trailers. Now, technically, a home, any prefabricated home built in a factory after 1976 is really technically a manufactured home. But there's some slippage in how we talk about these homes, and especially how we talk about the communities where they're placed. These manufactured home communities are what's more commonly called mobile home parks. And so you'll hear me kind of move between those terms just to be in keeping with good common parlance. So the US housing census tells us that about 17.5 million Americans live in a manufactured home. And about 3 million of these homes are placed in land lease communities known as mobile home parks or manufactured home communities. That's really important because that means that particular housing stock has a unique land tenure, you know, where residents primarily own the home, but the vast majority of them are renting the land where they place the home. So this is our object of analysis in this study, is housing that's located in these mobile home parks. Without getting into many of the details, mobile home parks tend to be deeply affordable. Manufactured housing is already affordable, but when it's placed on land that residents don't have to purchase, it's even more affordable. And as a result, this manufactured home parks are a critical source of housing for many households in poverty. So my colleague Noah Durst and I estimate that 30% of households living in mobile home parks are living in poverty. That's compared to 8% of owners and 15% of renters in conventional housing. And one other kind of point that's important to note, you know, we talk so much about public housing as a source of affordable housing. Housing in mobile home parks is providing roughly 3 times the number of housing units, or manufactured housing generally is providing nearly 3 times the number of housing units as public housing, just to give you a kind of comparison there. Given the importance of manufactured housing in mobile home parks, what does the research tell us about their risk to climate change? Well, it's really fair to say that mobile home parks are really understudied in the disaster and climate change literatures, although that's very much starting to change, as evidenced by, you know, these 2 other exciting papers that we're seeing in development as part of this session. The research that we do have, including our work in Colorado and Texas, show that mobile home parks are spatially concentrate households who are socially vulnerable to disasters. So as I said, a third of households living in these mobile home parks are living in poverty, and mobile home parks also tend to concentrate households that are socially vulnerable on a number of different measures. They tend to be, they constitute many elderly households, many households with disabilities, many households that speak a language other than English, and many immigrant households. And while they concentrate socially vulnerable populations, we also know that mobile home parks are disproportionately located in hazard-prone land, especially floodplains. There's also some regional disparities in where manufactured housing is located. So manufactured housing is extremely prevalent across the South and the Sun Belt states, especially in states like Florida, Texas, New Mexico, California. And these are many of the areas that are really bearing the brunt of climate change impacts related to disasters. Finally, research suggests that our hazard mitigation strategies and disaster recovery policy frameworks, which tend to be the backbone of our federal adaptation programs, are really designed to benefit single-family homeowners. We have research that documents the vulnerabilities of renters, but as the papers on this panel are making clear, housing type also matters. So with this literature as our foundation, we are asking this question in our study: how will future climate-related hazards impact mobile home parks in the US? And we are studying this question in 3 hurricane-impacted areas across Florida and Texas. The greater Houston area after Hurricane Harvey, the Florida Panhandle after Hurricane Michael, and South Florida after Hurricane Irma. Together, these represent really diverse metro regions with significant numbers of housing units and significant numbers of mobile home parks, and really substantial spatial differences from, urban, suburban, exurban, rural, along with many different demographic differences. Our study is very much still in progress, in part because of some of the data challenges that I want to talk about that tend to obscure mobile home parks. A key goal of this project is to complement numerous case studies, or smaller studies of mobile home parks, with a larger, very high quality, large sample, quantitative analysis of large metro areas that are spatially diverse and cross-cutting. So today, as I said, this research is ongoing, is in development, and so I just want to share some about our approach and some preliminary findings. As I said, one of the first challenges of doing mobile home park research, and we heard this from CJ Gabbe in the first presentation, is locating the parks themselves. Many states, including Texas, do not maintain statewide listings of mobile home parks. And the data that is available is often incomplete or out of date. So for our research, we're using a unique methodology that relies upon tax parcel records combined with several national data sets and remotely sensed imagery. So we're using county level tax appraisal district data, and we're combining that with data from Reference USA and data from the Department of Homeland Security, which does maintain its own national inventory of mobile home parks that we have found many issues with, including just oversight of parks that exist and misclassification of land uses that are not mobile home parks included in the database. So while the database that we are developing is surely imperfect, we do believe it is perhaps the most complete accounting of mobile home parks across a major multi-county area to date. While we're compiling this data set, just as a methodological side note, we encounter many issues with identifying these parks. I mean, this is a really painstaking process with a high level of quality control and data cleaning required, including, our research team looking at remotely sensed data. So here's just a couple of the types of uncertainties that can lead to problems like those that we're finding in the Department of Homeland Security data, which uses object identification to find these parks. They can oftentimes be covered by trees. They can be overcrowded, so it's hard to differentiate the units from each other. They can be misclassified as RV parks, which are not the same as the permanent housing that's supplied by manufactured housing that's located in mobile home parks. And there's also many, many issues with boundary that are misplaced. So in terms of climate adaptation, our next step was to overlay the data that we've collected with information about future flood hazards. And we've used a relatively straightforward method of overlaying the national flood hazard layer along with digital floodplain maps. A key challenge here is that floodplain data becomes less available and less reliable the further you move out from urban areas and the further you move out from recently declared disaster areas. And you know, manufactured home communities, mobile home parks tend to be are prevalent in these areas as well. A next step, and here, this is very much a step that is taking longer than we anticipated. We are using best available public information about future climate conditions and mapping that on top of our analysis. Specifically, we're using sea level rise, coastal storm surge, and high tide flooding data for 2 emissions scenarios that are deemed most likely by the recent IPCC report. So here are some examples of where our analysis currently puts us. In the Florida Panhandle, we find that nearly a third of mobile home parks, you have to consider that these parks can contain hundreds of individual households. So a third of mobile home parks are located in the 100-year floodplain, or the 1% annual chance. These parks are heavily concentrated in several coastal areas and in upland riverine floodplains. Now, this is not on the map, but our preliminary analysis also indicates that we're likely to see the intensification of risk to parks that are already along the coastal flood hazard areas, and upwards of 20% of parks that are currently outside the regulatory floodplain, but that may fall within that floodplain over the next several decades as these floodplains expand. Here's another example from the Houston area. Here we found that a quarter of parks are located within the regulatory floodplain. There are also fewer overall parks. There are fewer overall parks on the coastal areas, as we saw in Bay County in Florida. But nevertheless, we expect that future climate conditions will worsen flood hazards in these areas. In this case, the climate analysis is a bit more challenging and something that we're working through. And so we hope to be able to share more definitive findings in the near future. But the overall trend is that a significant share of mobile home park housing is located in floodplains and in areas that we expect to become more hazardous over time. And a key point here is related to the spatial clustering of parks and of manufactured housing within parks. And this is why housing type is so important to think about. Because of exclusionary land use policy that has segregated housing by housing type and required that manufactured housing not be located near conventional housing, this has meant that manufactured housing tends to be clustered. And it means that the way parks are regulated, allowed or disallowed in current plans, many future parks will likely be developed in areas where they already exist, which are already at higher risk from climate conditions. Now, these kind of cyclonic events are not a part of our analysis, which really relates to flooding from hurricanes. But I do want to acknowledge, the events of the past several weeks have really highlighted the challenge of current climatic conditions to the survival and safety of mobile home park residents across Louisiana, Tennessee, So this is a before and after image of a mobile home park in southern Louisiana that was exposed to a high wind event from Hurricane Ida. And so just with all of you gathered here today, I want to highlight these cyclonic storms as a really important site of future research. So in keeping with the theme of today's panel and in the spirit of action, here are some bigger picture adaptation priorities that we can draw from this analysis and from other bodies of work. One is that data is key. I mean, in the example, in CJ Gabbe's example from the first presentation that we saw today, we can't even begin to understand the impact of, say, heat on this housing type until we're able to know where it's located. And so we really need to invest in state and national level data on these parks and their locations. And at the same time, we need to understand that mobile home parks are not a monolith. They include many varied types of communities, from small, aging mom and pop parks to large corporately owned parks. And that means that, you know, infrastructure, disaster mitigation, exposure, climatic exposure, and conditions may all be different. So we really need a better typology of community risk in these places. And that includes what we're going to hear in the next presentation, how perhaps the ownership structure of these communities also matters. We also need to look to our local governments. In our work in Colorado, we found that local governments can really be complicit in the vulnerability of households living in these manufactured home communities. Oftentimes, they're simply disadvantaged by omission. You know, where mobile home parks are invisible or overlooked by policymakers, and so they may be lost in the recovery process or lost in the mitigation process. And again, I'll say this by way of, you know, attempting to offer a seamless segue to Zachary Lamb's presentation. We also really need to understand how we can explore alternative ownership in parks. Because as I said, the land tenure in these parks where residents are owning homes, but renting lands from private property owners who may have a financial incentive to not upgrade and not invest in the types of mitigating technologies that we saw in the chat, you know, with really adaptive solar screens. Well, there's an incentive for landlords not to invest in these types of infrastructures. So ownership structures matter. And that's my attempt at a seamless segue. And I'll just say thank you and acknowledge that this work could not be done without the support of the National Science Foundation. And also say that I'm always excited to talk about manufactured housing. And so feel free to reach out.
Esther, and despite that seamless segue, I'm going to ask if there are any quick questions for Esther. Despite the technical difficulties, I believe we are still on track. If we can have one maybe quick question for Esther, or we can wait until the end. Oh, we do have a question here. How does Houston's lack of zoning impact the location of mobile home parks and the type of land use policy solutions available in that region? And that's from Elena Bompidi. Sorry if I've done disservice to your name.
You know, that's a great question, and that is the classic question anytime you're talking about Houston. But you know, what we've seen and what other scholars have really shown is that in absence of zoning, other forms of land use regulation have really risen to produce conditions that are similar under zoning. So we see that, you know, in many other places, like in my research, in my historical research for my book on manufactured housing, I show how zoning is a key restriction that has segregated or completely outlawed manufactured housing across the nation. Now in Houston, without zoning, we still find that there are a variety of land use tools that are used to prohibit, if not outright exclude, manufactured housing. Now, in my own work, in my 2-year ethnography on manufactured housing, which was located in Florida and Texas, and in Texas was located in the Houston area, I found that on the ground that often looks a little different, in which you see manufactured housing more often, and you see it mixed in with other land uses more often than in other places. However, generally, the exclusionary tendencies of various land use tools result in a pattern where still manufactured home communities are segregated from other forms of housing and clustered together, even despite, the lack of zoning.
Thank you so much, Esther. And next we'll have our final presenter for this session, Zachary Lamb. Take it away, Zachary.
Right. I'm getting myself visible and audible here. Great. Thank you so much. And thanks so much to everybody who made it today for these talks. And thanks to my fellow panelists. This group of folks, CJ and Esther and Andy and Mark, have been enormously helpful to me and my co-authors on this work as we've gotten ourselves oriented in the world of manufactured housing over the last couple of years. So I'm really delighted to be able to share some of this early collaborative research with this group today. And I'm calling the talk Resident-Owned Resilience. Oh, let me advance. Here we go. There we go. Resident-Owned Resilience, Cooperative Land Ownership, and Transformative Climate Adaptation for Manufactured Housing Communities. And I know there's a lot to unpack there and the title and subtitle, but hopefully it'll become a little clearer by the end of my 15 minutes. So first, maybe we can begin with this idea of climate transformation, first of all, which is gaining increasing attention recently in many circles. And while the term is used in a number of different ways, I interpret climate transformation to mean, as Mark Pelling says here, seeking mechanisms through which climate action and adaptation can shift the balance of political and cultural power in society in ways that redress the existing inequalities that place the most disadvantaged people at the greatest peril in the face of climate change. Or maybe put more succinctly by Patty Romero-Lencao and her co-authors here, transformation depends on who has the power to act in the face of climate threats. And in this research, we focus on the potentials for transformative adaptation in an often ignored part of the low-income housing sector that you've already heard about today. And so thank you so much, Esther, for paving the way for me today, both today and in general with your amazing work in this space. So we're talking about manufactured housing. And as we just heard, manufactured housing is a large source of unsubsidized affordable housing in this country. So nearly 7 million households live in manufactured housing compared to just about 4.5 million in public housing and other forms of federally subsidized rental housing. And though manufactured housing is often thought of as a rural typology, over 50% of units are placed in urban and suburban areas. And these households in manufactured housing communities in particular face a double burden of insecure land tenure and hazard vulnerability, as we've been hearing just in the last talk. And so as my co-panelists have shown in their work, manufactured housing community residents face elevated hazard vulnerability for a number of complex reasons. So hazard researchers often describe vulnerability as the product of exposure to hazards, sensitivity to hazards, and the capacity of people or groups to adapt, to prepare or recover. And so manufactured housing residents are more exposed to hazards because, as we just were hearing, manufactured housing communities are often they're often marginalized through zoning and other land use tools, and therefore disproportionately located in hazard-prone locations. And households in manufactured housing communities are also more sensitive to hazards, both physically and socially. So the physical sensitivities come from both the units themselves, especially older units of manufactured housing built before the institution of federal building codes for manufactured housing in the mid-1970s, or from units that are poorly anchored to the ground. And then there's also a nexus of physical sensitivity that comes from the community infrastructure. So many manufactured housing communities own their own roads and drainage and power and water systems, and all of that comes with its own sensitivities, especially because many of those systems are quite old and aging. In many cases, they were kind of built in cut-rate ways to begin with, and they've been poorly maintained in the years since. And then finally, there's the social vulnerability aspect, which we've also heard about in terms of the ways in which residents of manufactured housing communities face elevated social vulnerability due to the sort of disproportionately large populations of folks who are low income, disabled, have low educational attainment, and other factors associated with social vulnerability. And then lastly, when we think about adaptive capacity, many manufactured housing communities, households suffer reduced adaptive capacity, both because of their economic precarity and because of their limited agency inherent in the tenure structure of many of these communities that Esther was just describing for us. And so just briefly to mention that this tenure vulnerability, and here's Esther's amazing book, which was absolutely critical for me in getting myself oriented in this space. So most manufactured housing community residents are what Esther calls halfway homeowners, owning their homes but not the land or infrastructure on which they depend. And this makes them very vulnerable to exploitation, extraction, and displacement, especially as manufactured housing communities are increasingly targeted for acquisition by large investors in search of profits. These profits are premised on the sort of ever deepening extraction from low-income residents who don't have many other options for housing. And so one alternative to this precarious tenure arrangement that's developed over the last 40 years is that of resident-owned communities. And ROC USA, Resident-Owned Communities USA, is the leading national advocacy and technical assistance provider in this space. And they built a national network of some 280 resident-owned communities with something like 18,000 households across the country, in which former tenants form cooperatives to buy the land on which their homes sit and institute a system of democratic self-governance to manage the community thereafter. And while this model has grown really rapidly in the last 30 years or so, there's very little research on the phenomena and really no research to date on how it might impact hazard vulnerability and adaptation. And so that's why, just a little over a year ago, my collaborators and I, Linda Shai and Jason Spicer, we started our research project to ask this question: how does the ROC USA model of cooperative land ownership and self-governance enable, or in some cases inhibit, adaptation to environmental stresses among residents in US manufactured housing communities? And so to date, the project has included GIS analysis of ROC and non-ROC sites in all the states that have significant numbers of ROC USA communities. We've done analysis of the co-op formation and governance processes, and we've done extensive interviewing with ROC USA staff, as well as technical assistance providers and co-op leaders and residents in a number of communities. And just to briefly dive into some of our findings. So all ROC USA communities were initially founded as conventional manufactured housing communities. And so therefore, it's maybe not surprising that there's no significant difference between ROC communities and other manufactured housing communities with respect to their hazard exposure, as measured by their proximity to FEMA flood plains or SHELDIS data on the hazard damage at the county level. So we found there were there's also, as Esther and CJ were just saying, there's no reliable data on the demographics or physical characteristics of ROC communities or of non-ROC manufactured housing communities nationwide. And so we found that the census tracts and counties in which ROCs are located are not significantly different from those in which other manufactured housing communities are located with respect to key indicators of social vulnerability. Our interviews suggest that ROC communities, like other manufactured housing communities, suffer from the same kind of physical vulnerabilities associated with old manufactured housing units and aging and failing infrastructure. And so while we found little evidence that the Rock USA model impacts exposure or sensitivity to hazards, we did find some evidence that the Rock model can impact adaptive capacity, both enabling and, as I said earlier, in some cases actually inhibiting adaptive capacity by shaping access to resources, institutional and social capacity, and access to relevant information and skills. And so I'll briefly walk through these elements. So with respect to access to resources, cooperative ownership can actually limit access to conventional lending. So we heard from several interviewees that they'd struggled to access necessary loans from conventional lenders, including one co-op in Southern California that was trying to recover from a wildfire disaster that wiped out half of the community. But on the other hand, Rock USA acts as a community development finance institution to provide subsidized loans for Rock communities and also technical assistance. The technical assistance that comes along with the Rock USA model frequently can facilitate grants and loans from public, private, and philanthropic sources to support capital improvements in Rock communities. For instance, One Rock in the Twin Cities in Minnesota told us that after financing their resident purchase through a loan from Rock USA, the community prioritized building an improved storm shelter, a tornado shelter, which you can see here on the right, that also doubles as a community hall for the community. And so the funds from the shelter came from a combination of the residents voting to increase their own rent by a small amount to raise funds, and also a state grant facilitated by their Rock USA technical assistance provider. And then, so converting tenants to co-op owners creates opportunities and challenges, again, with respect to institutional and social capacity. We heard several accounts in which decision-making in co-ops was slow or derailed by pre-existing social divisions within communities. However, the Rock model has evolved to provide lots of support for community governance, from regular training and technical support to peer-to-peer networking. And in our interviews, we heard repeatedly about the importance of investing not only in formal governance capacity, but also in cultivating informal community cohesion and solidarity within ROCs. So for instance, one Latina-led co-op in Metro Houston explained that their decision to invest in energy efficient lighting and upgraded drainage, which we can see here in the photo below, arose out of their sort of shared commitment to the children in the community, saying, these are our children. We can't be thinking about these as short-term solutions. And then in other cases, we heard from co-op boards that maybe needed some external encouragement to invest in community building. So one technical assistance provider in Colorado reported encouraging boards to invest in informal community building through events like trick-or-treating or holiday potlucks to kind of overcome some of the pre-existing social barriers within the community that can hamper their capacity to deal with challenges in addition to just dealing with day-to-day management. And then finally, the ROC model can improve community adaptive capacity through both external and internal skills and information. So ROC USA's model for acquisition finance includes ongoing technical assistance and training throughout the life of the co-op's loans. And further, by transforming tenants into co-op owners and managers, the model enables residents to make use of their own experiential knowledge and skills to recognize and address problems in their own communities. So for example, the pre-acquisition due diligence process for ROC co-op formation includes a resident infrastructure survey because, as a ROC USA official told us, residents know where the bodies are buried. That is, they know if the water systems leak. They know if there are drainage problems. They know if there's unreliable electricity. And so through this survey, they can kind of bring that experiential knowledge into the capital planning process for these communities. And we also heard from another co-op leader in Minnesota who reported that when a windstorm knocked down trees in their community, blocking a road, they were able to mobilize residents with chainsaws within 15 minutes to take care of the problem rather than waiting for an off-site owner or manager to take action. And so based on this early research, we regard the ROC USA model of limited equity cooperatives as holding tremendous promise. Both is a scalable networked model for shared tenure housing and self-governance that has powerful implications both for the manufactured housing community space, but also for other areas of the affordable housing sector. And we also see the potential of the ROC model as a platform that shifts who has the power to act in the face of climate change. Again, returning to this question of transformative climate action, joining experiential knowledge to enhance agency for a sort of middle scale adaptation between the scale of the individual household and the scale of a municipal or county government. And finally, the sort of semi-autonomous infrastructural arrangements that are common in many ROCs and other manufactured housing communities provide exciting opportunities for community-based climate action, both to enhance resilience to hazards and also to advance energy justice and decarbonization. So just to wrap up here, we're currently working on the next phases of this work right now, and we're sort of following out a few different threads. So first, we're working with ROC USA to generate a framework for a research collaboration for a national study of how the ROC model shapes climate action and health equity. Second, we're surveying the landscape of resident-owned manufactured housing communities in California, where I'm a relatively new resident, and seeking out paired case studies of climate-impacted ROC communities to pair against investor-owned manufactured housing communities that faced similar climate hazards or experiences. And then finally, with my co-author Linda Shai and Rob Olshansky, we're developing a broader research agenda, assessing the planning and design implications of diverse property regimes in responding to climate change. And we're calling that effort GLADE, for Governing Land for a Dynamic Earth. And so with that, I'll go ahead and close out, and hopefully we still have a few minutes to have a shared conversation.
We indeed do. Thank you so much, Zachary, for that. Are there any questions for Zachary or for any of the other panelists? We have, by my watch, about 5 minutes before we have to leave the room, so to speak. Either in the chat, or I think there's some way for you to raise your hand. I don't know that I can see if you've raised your hand, unfortunately, so someone else will have to attend to that. If I can then maybe just use my privilege here to ask Zach a question. So here in Tucson, where I'm based, I don't study co-ops or resident-owned communities. In fact, we have no ROC USA formed co-ops. But where I have done interviews in co-ops, the monthly housing costs are substantially lower. I mean, this seems to be one of the main sources of adaptive capacity, is that there's just more money left over at the end of the month. And I'm wondering if you've seen any data looking at housing cost burden or total housing costs between co-ops or resident-owned communities versus more conventional mobile home parks.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, Mark, and one that we're diving into a little bit. I mean, so the existing studies that I've seen on this, ROC USA does a periodic sort of rent survey to estimate how their parks relate in terms of the lot rents that are charged to residents relative to the market in each area, and they generally find that while immediately after co-op formation, sometimes there's a bump up in lot rents because all of a sudden this community has to cover the carrying costs of this big loan that they've just taken on to buy the park. But then they find that over time, the escalations in rents actually is much slower than in the market rate parks and investor-owned parks, because investor-owned parks are sort of premised on this model of tightening the screws ever tighter, raising rents and fees ever higher. And so for obvious reasons, in a co-op or a resident-owned park, the incentive is there to keep costs low. And in fact, what we found is that in some cases, the issue can actually be that sometimes there's actually a little bit of a tendency to not raise lot rents enough to build capital reserves and cover costs. And so, I think that's one of the interesting dynamics that can play out in these shared tenure models, is that they have to be able to build up their reserves and be fiscally responsible enough to deal with hazards and other disruptions, but also keep costs low enough to maintain affordability.
Great, thank you, Zach. I think we have maybe time for one last question. Looks like Elena has a question here. Has ROC developed or is developing an internal set of policies to address climate-related risks to mobile home parks?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the ROC model does include, this really extensive set of management practices that includes some basic stuff around, evacuation planning, emergency planning, that kind of stuff. But really, they think of themselves as being in the community development finance business, and so when we've started this conversation with them around how we might help to with doing some training or helping them to integrate climate modeling into their due diligence processes, because much of the leverage they have to help these communities adapt comes when they're putting together the financing for residents to buy their communities, and so they need to be able to assess future risk to know where to invest. And to date, the ways that they assess that future risk don't actually take into account climate change. And so we see that as one place where there's definitely a need for action, and the ROC leadership has definitely been very receptive to that idea as well.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think that takes us to our time almost exactly. This was awesome. I have so many questions. But hopefully we'll be able to all get together at some point and continue the conversation. So thank you all for coming. I skimmed back through all of the slides here so that I could try to give Gregory Wright a list of all of the email addresses here, but I don't think there's a slide that has all of the email addresses up there. So Gregory, if you could just get in contact with the individual presenters. And I'll also plug the next session, which will be starting at 10:15. So we've got a few that are happening, emerging research on financial adaptations to climate impacts. Gosh, I want to stay around for that one. Wading into the economic impacts of climate change on water, and equitable adaptation to climate-related flood risks. So please stick around for any of those if you're interested. Thanks all. Thanks to all the panelists. Thanks to CJ Gabbe. Thanks to Smitha Rao. Thanks to Esther Sullivan and Zachary Lamb, and to Luskin for organizing this event. Bye, everyone.